It was 11:14 at night when David Whitfield's phone lit up for the first time. Unknown caller. He almost let it ring out, the way he had trained himself to ignore anything unfamiliar after everything he had been through. But something about the timing made his stomach tighten. He picked it up, said nothing, and the line went dead before he could speak. 30 seconds later, it rang again. Then again. By midnight, the missed calls on his screen had climbed past 40. By 1 in the morning, they had reached 100. Same number every single time. No voicemail, no text, just silence on the other end, over and over, like someone was building up the courage to say something they had been holding onto for 5 long years. 5 years earlier, David had watched his entire life get carried out of his house in cardboard boxes while his wife stood in the driveway with a lawyer beside her. She took the house. She took the savings account they had built together since their 20s. She took his name and dragged it through a courtroom until strangers in that small Ohio town looked at him differently on the street. He remembers standing in an empty living room, the carpet still showing the outline of where their couch used to be, wondering how a marriage that once felt unbreakable could end with him holding nothing but a duffel bag and a set of car keys. He did not know it then, but that night in the empty house was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning of one nobody, not even her, would ever have guessed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What David did not know, sitting there staring at his phone at 1 in the morning, was that the woman calling him 100 times that night had spent the last several hours watching him on national television. She had not planned to turn the TV on. She had not planned to see his face, larger than life, on a screen in her living room, 5 years after she swore she would never think about him again. But there he was. And the moment she saw him, something inside her that she had buried for half a decade came rushing back all at once, so fast and so hard that she could not stop her hands from shaking as she reached for her phone. To understand why a woman who once walked away with everything would be sitting alone at midnight, calling the man she left behind 100 times in a single night, you have to go back much further than that phone call. You have to go back to who David Whitfield was before any of this happened, before the divorce, before the empty house, before the television cameras. Because the man calling that number back the next morning was not the same man his ex-wife thought she had left behind. And what she was about to find out over the course of that one phone call would change the way she understood everything that had happened between them. This is the story of a man who lost everything on paper and rebuilt something no courtroom could ever take from him. It is the story of a woman who thought she had closed a chapter for good, only to discover that some chapters have a way of finding you again when you least expect it. And it is the story of 100 phone calls that neither of them will ever forget. Stay with us, because by the time this story ends, you are going to understand exactly what she lost the night she walked out that door, and exactly what it cost her to finally pick up the phone and call him back. To understand what happened between David and the woman who would one day call him 100 times in a single night, you first have to understand who David Whitfield was long before any of it began. He grew up in a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher, in a house where money was always tight, but love was never in short supply. He was the kind of kid who fixed things for the neighbors before he even had his driver's license. The kind of teenager who spent his weekends in the garage tinkering with old engines instead of going to parties. By the time he graduated high school, he had already built a small reputation around town as the guy you called when something broke and you could not afford to replace it. David never went to college. He could not afford it. And honestly, he never felt like he needed a degree to prove what he already knew he was good at. Instead, he took a job at a local auto shop, learned everything he could from the older mechanics, and quietly started dreaming about something bigger. He kept a notebook in the drawer of his nightstand filled with sketches and ideas, small inventions and improvements he thought could change the way ordinary people repaired their own cars. Nobody knew about that notebook except him. He never showed it to a single soul, not because he was ashamed of it, but because somewhere along the way he had convinced himself that dreams like his were meant for other people, not for a mechanic's son from a town most people had never heard of. Rachel Coleman walked into that same auto shop on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when David was 26 years old, her car sputtering and refusing to start, her arms full of grocery bags she had been too stubborn to leave in the back seat. She was sharp, funny in a way that caught him off guard, and completely unimpressed by the fact that he clearly knew more about her car than she did. He fixed the problem in 20 minutes and somehow spent the next 2 hours talking to her in the parking lot, neither one of them quite ready to say goodbye. Within a year, they were married in a small backyard ceremony with folding chairs and string lights, surrounded by people who genuinely believed they were watching two people who had found exactly what they were looking for in each other. The first few years of their marriage were, by almost every measure, good ones. They rented a small house on the edge of town, the kind with a porch that creaked and a yard just big enough for a garden Rachel insisted on planting every spring, even though half of it never survived the summer heat. David worked long hours at the shop, and Rachel took a job at a local accounting firm, steadily working her way up while David quietly kept adding sketches to that notebook he still never showed anyone. They talked about the future the way young couples do, filled with plans that felt entirely possible because neither of them had any reason yet to doubt each other. On weekends, they would drive out to the lake, and more than once Rachel caught David staring off toward the water with a look on his face like he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere only he could see. It was Rachel, in fact, who first found the notebook, nearly 3 years into their marriage, tucked away while she was looking for a missing sock in his dresser drawer. She sat on the edge of their bed for almost an hour flipping through pages of sketches and half-finished ideas, stunned that the man she had married had been carrying an entire second life inside his head that he had never once mentioned to her. When David came home that evening and found her sitting there with the notebook open in her lap, he braced himself for questions he did not know how to answer. Instead, she looked up at him and asked why in the world he had never told her any of this. That night became one of the best conversations of their marriage, and for a while afterward, it seemed like something had shifted, like David finally believed someone other than himself thought his ideas were worth pursuing. But belief, as it turned out, was not the same thing as opportunity. Money stayed tight no matter how many extra shifts David picked up, and every time he brought up the idea of investing in his own designs, life seemed to hand them another bill instead. A car accident that was not his fault, but still cost them thousands in medical expenses. A roof that needed replacing after a storm tore through their neighborhood. A pregnancy that, quietly and painfully, did not carry to term, leaving both of them changed in ways they did not fully know how to talk about with each other. Piece by piece, the version of their marriage built on shared dreams began to feel further away, replaced by a version built on simply getting through each month without falling further behind. By their 8th year of marriage, David and Rachel had settled into a rhythm that looked, from the outside, perfectly normal. They still went to the same church on Sundays. They still hosted the same 4th of July cookout every summer for their small circle of friends. But underneath that routine, something had quietly gone missing between them, the kind of thing that is almost impossible to point to as a single moment because it happens in 1,000 small ones instead. David stopped mentioning the notebook. Rachel stopped asking about it. They started having entire dinners in near silence, not out of anger, but out of a distance neither of them seemed to know how to close anymore. Friends who knew them well started to notice it too. The way David would answer questions about Rachel a little too carefully. The way Rachel would change the subject whenever someone asked how things were going at home. Looking back now, almost everyone who knew them agrees on one thing. There was no single explosive fight, no one dramatic betrayal that anyone could point to as the moment everything fell apart. It was slower than that, and in some ways harder to make sense of because of it. What finally happened between David and Rachel, and the decision that would send both of their lives down completely different paths for the next 5 years started on what David still describes as an entirely ordinary Tuesday, a day that began no differently than 100 others before it. He had no idea, walking out the door that morning with his coffee in hand, that by the time he came home that evening, the life he had built for nearly a decade would already be over. That Tuesday started the same way most of David's mornings did. He kissed Rachel goodbye at the door, told her he would be home a little late because the shop had 3 cars backed up, and drove off without giving the moment a second thought. What he did not know was that Rachel had spent the previous 3 nights barely sleeping, running through a conversation in her head that she had been avoiding for months. She had already made an appointment with a lawyer the week before, quietly, on her lunch break, telling no one, not even her closest friend. By the time David pulled into the driveway that evening, tired and smelling like motor oil, Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table with a folder in front of her, and the look on her face told him immediately that something had changed. Depending on who you ask, and David is the first to admit this, the story of what happened next has 2 very different versions. Rachel would later tell friends that she had felt invisible in that marriage for years, that David had become so consumed by long shifts and quiet withdrawal into himself that she had started to feel like she was living alone in a house with another person. She pointed to a co-worker at her accounting firm, a man named Marcus who had become, in her words, simply a friend who actually asked her how her day was going. David, on the other hand, remembers a wife who had grown distant long before he ever worked a single extra shift, a marriage where he felt like every attempt he made to reconnect was met with silence. Neither version excuses what came next. Both of them, in their own way, are probably true. What is not in dispute is what happened over the following 6 weeks. Rachel moved forward with the divorce filing faster than David could process it, hiring an aggressive lawyer who made it clear from the very first meeting that this was not going to be an amicable split. David, blindsided and still reeling, could not afford a lawyer of the same caliber, and he made the mistake almost every person in his position makes, assuming that because he had done nothing legally wrong, the outcome would somehow reflect that. It did not. Ohio's laws around marital property meant that nearly everything they had built together over 8 years, the house, the joint savings account, even a portion of the small side income David had started earning fixing cars on weekends, was suddenly on the table, and Rachel's lawyer was determined to make sure as little of it as possible ended up with David. The mediation sessions were, by David's own account, some of the most humiliating experiences of his life. He sat across a conference table from a woman he had shared a bed with for 8 years while lawyers argued over spreadsheets and asset valuations, as if his entire adult life could be reduced to numbers on a page. At one point, Rachel's lawyer brought up the notebook, the one filled with David's sketches and half-finished designs, suggesting that any future income from those ideas should be considered part of the marital estate, since the concepts had been developed during the marriage. David remembers sitting there in stunned silence, watching the one part of himself he had never fully shared with anyone get picked apart by strangers in suits who had no idea what any of it actually meant to him. David's older brother, Tom, tried to warn him early on to fight harder, to get better legal representation even if it meant going into debt to do it. David refused, telling Tom that he did not have the stomach for a prolonged legal battle and that he just wanted it over with as quickly as possible. Tom has said since that this was the single biggest mistake David made during the entire process, a decision driven less by strategy and more by exhaustion and a quiet kind of shame that made David want to disappear from the whole situation rather than fight through it. Whether Tom was right is something David has wrestled with for years, but at the time, all David wanted was for the shouting, the paperwork, and the version of himself sitting in those mediation rooms to simply be over. The final settlement, when it came, was worse than even David had allowed himself to expect. Rachel kept the house outright, the same house with the creaking porch where they had planted a garden together nearly a decade earlier. She kept the entirety of their joint savings account, money David had spent years setting aside from double shifts and weekend repair jobs. She kept the car that was fully paid off, leaving David with an older vehicle that barely ran and a small storage unit's worth of belongings that fit into the back of a borrowed pickup truck. When it was all finalized, David walked out of that courthouse with nothing but a duffel bag of clothes, a single box of tools from the garage, and that same notebook, the one thing nobody in that courtroom had actually managed to take from him, even if they had tried. The night he moved the last of his things out of the house, David stood in the empty living room for a long time before he finally left. The carpet still held the faint outline of where their couch used to sit. Sunlight coming through the window landed on a bare patch of wall where their wedding photo had hung for years. He has said in later interviews that he did not cry that night, not because he was not devastated, but because he felt strangely numb, like the emotional weight of everything happening around him had not fully caught up to him yet. He locked the front door behind him for the last time, got into that barely running car, and drove to his brother Tom's spare bedroom with absolutely no idea what he was supposed to do with the rest of his life. For the first several weeks afterward, David barely left that spare bedroom except to go to work. He had lost his house, his savings, and in a very real sense, his identity as a husband, all within the span of a few months. Friends from the old neighborhood stopped calling as often, unsure of what to say to a man who seemed to have vanished from the version of life they had all known him in. Rachel, for her part, stayed in town, kept her job at the accounting firm, and by all outward appearances, moved forward relatively quickly. Word around town was that she and Marcus had started seeing each other openly within a few months of the divorce being finalized, a detail that reached David secondhand through a mutual friend and left him sitting alone in that spare bedroom for a long time afterward, staring at a notebook he had not opened in weeks. What almost nobody knew, not Tom, not Rachel, not a single person from that old neighborhood, was that somewhere in the middle of that darkest stretch, David had quietly started opening that notebook again, late at night, when the house was silent and there was nothing left to lose by dreaming a little. He did not know it yet, sitting there in a borrowed bedroom with a car that barely ran and a bank account that barely existed. But the next 5 years of his life were about to take a turn that neither he, nor Rachel, nor anyone who thought they understood how this story was supposed to end, could have possibly seen coming. Year 1 was, in David's own words, the hardest 12 months of his entire life. He was still living in his brother Tom's spare bedroom, still working the same long hours at the auto shop, and still carrying a quiet weight around with him that most people who knew him casually never noticed. He had gone from a married homeowner with a savings account to a 34-year-old man sleeping on a pull-out couch, and there were nights that first winter when he genuinely wondered if this was simply going to be the rest of his life. But somewhere around the 6-month mark, something small shifted. He started pulling that old notebook out again, not every night, but often enough that Tom began noticing the light still on under the guest room door well past midnight. What David was working on, at first, was nothing more than a distraction, a way to occupy a mind that otherwise spent too much time replaying the last several years. But the ideas in that notebook were not random. They centered around a single, specific problem he had spent nearly a decade watching customers struggle with at the auto shop, a repair tool that did not yet exist in any hardware store or parts catalog, one that could save ordinary car owners hundreds of dollars by letting them fix a common transmission issue themselves instead of paying a mechanic. David had sketched versions of this tool years earlier, back when Rachel first found the notebook, but he had never once believed it was something he could actually build. Now, with nothing left to lose, he decided to try. The first prototype took him almost 4 months to build in Tom's garage, using scrap metal, borrowed equipment, and every spare hour he had outside of his day job. It barely worked. The second version worked a little better. By the 5th attempt, nearly a year and a half after the divorce was finalized, David had something that actually functioned the way he had originally imagined it in that notebook a decade earlier. He brought it to his old boss at the auto shop, half expecting to be laughed out of the building. Instead, his boss tested it on 3 different customer vehicles over the course of a single week and told David flatly that if he did not find a way to sell this thing, somebody else eventually would. That conversation led David to a man named Walter Briggs, a retired small business owner who had spent 30 years running a regional hardware supply chain before selling it and settling into a quieter life outside of town. Walter had heard about David's tool through a mutual acquaintance and reached out simply out of curiosity, expecting to spend 20 minutes indulging a mechanic side project before politely moving on with his day. Instead, he stayed for 3 hours, asking question after question, and by the end of that afternoon, Walter had agreed to become David's first informal mentor, teaching him everything he did not know about manufacturing, patents, and the process of turning a garage prototype into an actual product people could buy. The next 2 years were, by David's own description, a blur of small failures stacked on top of one another until they eventually started adding up to something real. His first attempt at manufacturing a small batch of the tool nearly wiped out every dollar he had saved since the divorce, when a supplier delivered a defective run of parts just weeks before David's first scheduled sale. A local business competition he entered, hoping for a modest cash prize to keep the project alive, ended with him placing a distant third behind 2 ideas that never went anywhere afterward, a rejection that stung far more than David expected it to at the time. There was a stretch of nearly 6 months where he seriously considered giving the entire thing up and going back to simply being a mechanic who occasionally wondered what might have been. It was Walter, more than anyone, who kept David from walking away during that stretch, reminding him more than once that almost nobody succeeds on their first, second, or even 5th attempt at anything worth doing. Slowly, painfully, things started to turn. A small online listing David set up almost as an afterthought began attracting attention from car enthusiasts and independent mechanics across the country, drawn in by word of mouth and a handful of glowing reviews from early customers who could not believe how much money the tool had saved them. Within a year, what had started as a handful of orders shipped out of Tom's garage had grown into a small but genuine business, one that finally allowed David to move into a modest apartment of his own for the first time since the divorce, nearly 3 years after he had walked out of that courthouse with nothing but a duffel bag and a box of tools. While all of this was happening, David rarely thought about Rachel, or at least that is what he told himself at the time. Word occasionally reached him through old mutual friends that she and Marcus had moved in together, that she seemed happy, that life in their old town had simply continued on without him in it. He did not reach out. He did not ask for details. Building something entirely his own had given him a sense of purpose he had not felt in years, and for the first time since the divorce, David found himself thinking less about everything he had lost and more about everything he was quietly building back, piece by piece, in a small apartment above a hardware store nearly 200 miles from the house, with the creaking porch he used to call home. The turning point that eventually put David in front of a national audience came almost by accident. A regional business journalist, working on a story about small manufacturers finding success through online sales, reached out to interview him for what David assumed would be a minor local feature. That article ended up catching the attention of a producer for a nationally televised program that highlighted independent inventors and small business owners across the country, the kind of show that took ordinary people with real products and gave them a chance to present their work in front of a wide television audience. David almost turned down the invitation to appear, telling Walter he did not think he had the kind of story anyone would want to watch. Walter, characteristically blunt, told him that was exactly the kind of story people needed to see. David spent nearly 6 weeks preparing for that television appearance, rehearsing how he would explain both his product and, if asked, the years of struggle that had led him to build it. When the day finally came, He stood under studio lights in front of cameras and a live audience, describing not just a repair tool he had built with his own hands, but the entire journey that had led him there, starting from a notebook he had once been too afraid to show anyone, all the way through a divorce that had left him with almost nothing. He did not mention Rachel by name during that interview. He did not need to. Anyone who had known him during those years would have immediately recognized exactly which chapter of his life he was describing when the episode finally aired on national television, nearly 5 years to the week after he had walked out of that empty house for the last time. 200 miles away, in the same house with the creaking porch, Rachel Coleman was folding laundry on the couch when she turned on the television that night, expecting nothing more than background noise while she finished a chore she had done 1,000 times before. She was not looking for David. She had not searched for his name in years, had trained herself a long time ago to stop wondering what had become of him after their divorce. But when his face appeared on the screen, larger than life, standing under studio lights and describing a product he had built with his own 2 hands, Rachel set the laundry down on the cushion beside her and simply stopped moving entirely. At first, she told herself it had to be a coincidence, some other man who happened to share David's build and the particular way he tilted his head when he was concentrating. But then he began describing the notebook, the very same one she had found tucked away in his dresser drawer nearly a decade earlier, the one she had once sat with on the edge of their bed for almost an hour, stunned by everything he had never told her. Rachel realized, watching him speak with a confidence she had never once seen in him during their marriage, that this was not some other man at all. This was David, describing in front of a national television audience the exact idea she had once held in her own hands and asked him why he had never shared with her. What happened inside Rachel over the following hour is something she has since described as a kind of unraveling she was not prepared for. She sat frozen on that couch as the segment continued, listening to David describe years of struggle he never mentioned by name, a period of his life she had assumed, without ever really examining it, that he had simply moved past quickly and easily. She had spent 5 years telling herself a version of the divorce that made sense to her, one where she had made a difficult but necessary decision to leave a marriage that had already gone quiet long before any lawyer got involved. Watching David on that screen, describing a notebook full of dreams he had once been too afraid to share with anyone, forced her to confront a version of events she had spent 5 years choosing not to look at too closely. There was also something else weighing on Rachel that night, something almost nobody outside of her closest circle knew about. Her relationship with Marcus, the one that had begun so soon after the divorce that mutual friends had assumed for years it must have started before the papers were even signed, had quietly ended nearly 18 months earlier. Marcus had left for a job opportunity in another state, and rather than asking Rachel to come with him, he had simply gone, leaving her back in the same house with the same creaking porch, this time completely alone. She had told almost no one how much that ending had affected her, had continued showing up to work at the accounting firm and smiling through holidays with friends as though nothing about her life had fundamentally changed. Watching David that night, thriving in a way she never expected, arrived at the exact moment she had spent 1.5 years quietly wondering whether she had made the right decisions at every major turn in her life. Rachel picked up her phone for the first time around 11 that night, her thumb hovering over David's contact information, a number she had not deleted despite 5 years and every reason to have done so long ago. She called once, hung up before it even finished ringing, and sat there on the couch with her heart pounding, angry at herself for feeling as shaken as she did. She told herself she simply wanted to say she had seen the segment, to offer some kind of casual congratulations that would let her hang up the phone and move on with her evening. But somewhere underneath that explanation was something far more complicated, an entire 5 years of unresolved feelings that Rachel had successfully avoided examining until the exact moment she watched her ex-husband describe on national television, the very dream she once held in her own two hands and never truly understood. By midnight, Rachel had called 19 times. By 1 in the morning, the number had climbed past 60. She never left a voicemail, never sent a single text explaining herself, because every time she rehearsed what she might say, the words felt entirely inadequate for everything she actually wanted to communicate. Somewhere around call number 90, sitting alone in a dark living room at nearly 2 in the morning, Rachel finally admitted to herself what she had been avoiding all night. She was not calling to congratulate David on a business success. She was calling because watching him on that screen had made her realize, all at once and far too late, that she had spent 5 years measuring her own life against a version of David she had convinced herself no longer existed. And that version had never actually been true. David finally called her back the following morning, sitting in the small apartment above the hardware store that had become his home over the past several years. He almost let it go to voicemail one more time, uncertain whether he was ready to hear whatever Rachel had spent an entire night trying to say. When he finally answered, there was a long pause on the other end of the line before Rachel spoke, her voice quieter and more uncertain than he remembered it ever being during their marriage. She did not open with an apology, not at first. She opened by telling him she had watched the segment, that she recognized the notebook, and that she needed him to know she finally understood something about him that she wished she had understood 5 years earlier, back when it might have actually mattered. That phone call between David and Rachel lasted nearly 2 hours, far longer than either of them expected when it began. David listened as Rachel finally said out loud what she had spent 5 years avoiding, that she had left the marriage believing she was walking away from a man who had already checked out long before she filed the paperwork, and that watching him build something extraordinary out of the very notebook she had once encouraged him to pursue had forced her to question whether that belief had ever actually been fair to him. She told him about Marcus leaving, about the 1.5 years of quiet loneliness in that same house with the creaking porch, though she was careful to say she was not looking for sympathy, only honesty, the kind neither of them had managed to offer each other during the final years of their marriage. David, for his part, did not rush to forgive her, and he has said in later interviews that he is genuinely proud of himself for that. He told Rachel plainly that hearing her acknowledge what happened meant something to him, but that 5 years of rebuilding his life from nothing had taught him not to hand his sense of peace over to anyone else's timeline, including hers. He explained that he no longer carried the same anger he once had, that building something of his own had given him a kind of closure the divorce settlement never could, but that closure and reconciliation were not necessarily the same thing. Rachel, he later said, seemed to understand that distinction better than he expected her to, telling him she had not called hoping to undo the past, only hoping he would let her finally say the things she should have said years earlier. In the weeks that followed, David and Rachel spoke a handful of additional times, carefully and without any specific timeline in mind. They did not get back together, a detail David has been direct about whenever he is asked, because he believes audiences deserve honesty rather than a tidy ending that never actually happened. What did happen, according to people close to both of them, was something quieter and in some ways more meaningful than a reconciliation. Rachel eventually reached out to apologize more formally, not just to David but to Tom, whose spare bedroom had once been the only thing standing between David and complete homelessness during that first brutal year. David, in turn, stopped avoiding certain memories from their marriage that he had spent years pushing aside, allowing himself to remember the good years alongside the painful ending instead of treating the entire relationship as a single mistake. David's business, the one built entirely from a notebook he once believed nobody would ever take seriously, continued growing steadily in the months after that television appearance aired. Walter Briggs remained by his side as an advisor, proud, by his own admission, of a man he had once agreed to mentor almost purely out of curiosity. Tom has said in interviews since that watching his younger brother go from sleeping on a pull-out couch to building something entirely his own remains one of the things he is most proud of in his entire life. David eventually moved out of the apartment above the hardware store and bought a modest house of his own, one with a small garage where he still keeps that same notebook, now filled with several more years of ideas he no longer feels the need to hide from anyone. When people ask David today what he believes this entire experience says about loss, about second chances, or about the version of justice a courtroom is capable of delivering, he tends to give a fairly simple answer. He says that Rachel taking the house, the savings, and nearly everything they had built together on paper was, at the time, the most painful thing that had ever happened to him. But he also says, with a certainty that took him years to arrive at, that the one thing no courtroom, no lawyer, and no divorce settlement was ever capable of taking from him was the notebook full of ideas he had once been too afraid to believe in. Everything else, he says, could be divided, sold, or signed away. That could not. As for Rachel, she has spoken publicly only a handful of times about that night she called David 100 times, and each time she has been careful not to frame it as a story about winning him back. Instead, she describes it as the moment she finally understood that the story she had told herself about her own marriage, the one that made her decision to leave feel simple and justified, had never been the whole truth. She says she does not regret leaving, exactly, but she does regret how long it took her to actually see the person she was leaving, and how much of that clarity only arrived once it was already too late for it to change anything between them. Every so often, a story like David and Rachel's finds its way to us here, one that resists the easy version most people expect going in. This was never really a story about a man getting revenge on the woman who left him, and by the end, even David himself will tell you it never became one. It is a story about what happens when everything on paper is taken from you, and what, if anything, remains once the paperwork is finally settled. For David, what remained was a notebook nobody else believed in until he finally did. For Rachel, what remained, 5 years later, was a single phone call she felt compelled to make 100 times before she found the courage to say what she actually meant. We want to know what you would have done in David's position, sitting there at 1 in the morning watching that same number call again and again after 5 years of complete silence. Would you have answered on call number 1, or would you have waited, the way David did, until you felt ready to hear whatever was on the other end of that line? And for those of you who have lived through something similar, a divorce, a long silence, a phone call you never expected to receive years after you thought a chapter of your life was permanently closed, we would genuinely love to hear that story in the comments below. These are the details that make stories like this one worth telling in the first place. If this story affected you the way it affected everyone on our end while putting it together, we would appreciate you taking a moment to like this video and share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And if you have not already subscribed to this channel, now is the perfect time, because we have several more stories exactly like this one on the way, real accounts of ordinary people who lost everything and found their way back to something meaningful on the other side. Thank you for staying with us through this entire story from beginning to end. We will see you in the next one.